Welcome everyone to our first New York Society for General Semantics session of the year 2020. Yay! Yes, may it be the first of many, and may this be a year of clear vision. Now, as some of you know, I've made a habit of taking people who are visiting from out of town and putting them to work. And those of you that were with us last month, we had the pleasure of a guest from Bologna, Elena Lamberti, participating in our program. And this year we have the rare opportunity of including out-of-towners. And this is something that we've done for the past couple of years because around this time, usually on a Saturday, the Media Ecology Association has its annual board meeting. So there are a bunch of folks from out of town who come in for that meeting, and I put them to work. And so in this time, we have three visitors all from Canada.
Place of the royal refuge.
That's right.
So we're looking for both an interesting and a very nice program. This is the second time we've used the theme, the state of the semantic environment, which of course I take from the State of the Union, as a reflection on what's going on right now. Obviously, there's not too much going on right now, so they'll be hard-pressed to find something to talk about. But somehow we'll manage. But I do want to start off by noting that Alfred Korzybski, the founder of General Semantics, introduced the terms neuro-semantic and neuro-linguistic, and both in conjunction with his emphasis on what he referred to as an organism-as-a-whole-in-an-environment. And so in doing so, he made reference to the neuro-linguistic environment and the neuro-semantic environment that we inhabit. And following Korzybski's lead, Wendell Johnson introduced the concept of the semantic environment in his classic work on general semantics, People in Quandaries, which was not too long ago reissued by the Institute of General Semantics. Brian, you remember reading that, right? People in Quandaries?
Definitely. My favorite book.
Good, yeah, Robbie too. It was required reading for those of us in Neil Postman's ecology.
There are people who think it was the best book ever written.
But the people will think almost anything. Well, yes, definitely Lord of the Rings. But Neil Postman devoted a chapter of his 1976 study, Crazy Talk, Stupid Talk, to the topic of the semantic environment. And there he explains that, I'm going to quote, a semantic environment includes, first of all, people, second, their purposes, third, the general rules of discourse by which such purposes are usually achieved, and fourth, the particular talk actually being used in the situation. And he goes on by noting that there are many different types of semantic environments. He describes them as situations and social structures, and I quote again, in which people want to do something to, for, with, or against other people, as well as to, for, with, or against themselves. And Postman also specified that he was particularly concerned with those semantic environments which give form to our most important human transactions. And in an earlier essay that he wrote with the title, The Meaning of Meaning, which really resonates today, doesn't it? Demeaning and meaning. He maintained that, and I quote, "In considering the ecology of the semantic environment, we must take into account what is called the communications revolution." Camille's taking that class, Communication Revolution. And he goes on to observe that, and I quote again, "The invention of new and various media of communication has given a voice and an audience to many people whose opinions would otherwise not have been solicited, and who in fact have little, if anything, to contribute to public issues." These words resonate terribly today, terribly. And as Tom Gencarelli has pointed out, this was the point where Neil Postman really came into his own, and it is a kind of major milestone in the history of media ecology. And so we really are today looking forward to a kind of open-ended conversation and seeing what our panelists think about the state of the current semantic environment. And let me introduce them. On my far left, you're right. Got that?
Yeah.
We're confused.
Two glasses.
Kathy Adams
Hi, Kathy.
is a professor in the Faculty of Education, and she's also the Vargo Teaching Chair at the University of Alberta. Alberta's in Canada. Drawing on links between phenomenology, philosophy of technology, and media scholarship, her research addresses digital technology integration across K through 12 and post-secondary educational environments. She's particularly interested in the ethical and pedagogical implications of the widespread use of digital media and increasingly smart technologies as cognitive extenders in teaching and learning. But she's the co-author of Researching a Post-Human World, Interviews with Digital Objects.
Oh, great.
Next to Kathy is Paulo Granada. Can you tell which one he is?
Yeah.
As you might gather, he comes to us from Canada, but by way of, or actually Canada by way of it, no, Italy by way of Canada. He teaches in the Book and Media Studies program in the University of Toronto, St. Michael's College, where Marshall McLuhan taught for many years. See, they're very well trained. He joined the University of Toronto after spending 15 years at the University of Bologna in Italy, where he almost entirely established his own academic career in research teaching and public engagement. He's the coordinator of the Book and Media Studies program and director of the Media Ethics Lab at the University of Toronto, and he is, as of January 1st, the president of the Media Ecology Association. He is also a member of the Executive Committee of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO as chair of the Culture, Communication, and Information Sectoral Commission. We're very international. Finally, on my immediate left, which is your right, you got it, Jacqueline McLeod Rogers, professor and chair of the Department of Rhetoric, Writing, and Communication at the University of Winnipeg.
Oh, wow.
Winnipeg is in Canada. Very good. They learn, they're fast
But they
learners.
didn't get Manitoba.
That's true, Manitoba, see? No credit.
There's always one.
Partial credit. She's presented numerous papers, been invited to speak about Marshall McLuhan at a number of international scholarly conferences, and her publications include the anthology Finding McLuhan, The Mind, the Man, the Message, and also a special issue of the journal Imaginations called McLuhan and the Arts. She's currently awaiting the publication of a 6-chapter study of McLuhan and the city entitled McLuhan's Technosensorium City. And she's co-editing a volume on technology and family practices entitled Mothering Internet Kids. It's also begun a more expansive examination of creative tourism and locality. And she's recently joined the MEA board, and we're very happy to have her with us. And as we begin, I just want to mention, as I always do, that the New York Society for General Semantics brings these events to you free of charge.
Thank you.
And, well, no, it's not, well, two things. One is that we do encourage you to become members of the Institute of General Semantics, which you can find a link to on our site. And, if you become members of the Institute of General Semantics, and one of the benefits is a subscription to the journal, etc., edited by Tom Gencarelli. There he is right there. Formally edited some years ago by Neil Postman, among other people, and going back to S.I. Hayakawa. So we do encourage that. And also, if for some reason you have disposable cash and a spirit of generosity, there is a donate button on our website, so don't be shy. And with that, we'll begin. And we'll start our session. And I asked our panelists to begin telling us something about what's on their mind currently. And I feel like Paulo here has been on a program 2 years ago, right, with us? So since you're familiar, would you like to start us off? It's nothing to do with gender, I want to emphasize, or anything like that. It is simply that he's not the experienced one here, so
Absolutely.
please.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Lance, for this presentation. Thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure again. I want to acknowledge that the insights generated by crazy talk, stupid talk by Neil Postman. I was inspired by this reading, so thank you, Lance, for sharing and for facilitating this reflection. My first take on the semantic environment generated by one example that Neil Postman actually makes in this book chapter to explain what is a semantic environment. And among many other examples, one example is the confessional. So imagine you go at the church, you enter into the church, you find a confessional, you enter into the confessional.
How long has it been, Paulo?
Since his last confession.
I get that. And let's pretend, okay? Let's pretend. But think about at least get into it, and yes, the confessional, it is a semantic environment. It's generated by a dialogue with yourself, a dialogue with someone else, a dialogue with someone else upstairs. And it's a perfect example of this semantic environment, the confessional as a semantic environment. So now I have to confess. I have to confess that it resonates with the current state of semantic environment. Think about the social media or social platforms. What are the social media but a global, a social confessional, where we confess our sins sometimes, where we share our sins, any like we do, any comment, anything we post and share is a sort of private insight, a private internal semantic environment, internal dialogue with ourselves that is going to be shared with a community. It may be a small community of our friends, it may be a larger community on Twitter and so on, but we are using the current social media platforms as a social confessional, where we confess our sins. So my point is that there is, as Neil Postman used to say, a Faustian bargain. We are getting something, it's so nice to share, it's so nice to have fans and likes and acknowledgements and so on. So something we get, but a Faustian bargain, something we give up, we give out, right? In terms of privacy, in terms of the representation of ourselves in a global scale, in a larger community. So again, I wanted to point out that social media platforms provide us with a confessional, where we confess our sin, where we share our sins. But there is something we are losing. And sometimes, does not necessarily brings new insights and new things. So my take is that once we started using social media as a confessional, we have been losing something. We lost something in terms of the way we preserve our identity, the way we preserve who we are, the way we preserve that inner dialogue, which is part of the semantic environment. So using the language to really shape who you are, it became a public thing. That makes a huge difference, I think. Everything we do is public. I'm sure, as I did, some of you posted something online about tonight's event, right? Maybe extending your presence online because sharing what's going on tonight.
Well, we hope so.
Yeah, we hope so. But again, a Faustian bargain. So we get something, we lose something, we give up something, and this is something later we can dig deeper into.
Okay. Jackie, would you like to?
Sure, I'll comment and use some of your comments to move forward from. And I don't want to forget the great link that you just reminded me of. This one's tangential. It has to do with a visual rhetoric that I saw on a plane this morning. The committed degree to which we have now moved into our phones as a way of communicating, understanding ourselves, and relying on that more than inner dialogue or speech or writing. But I just wanted to roll back because that was really helpful. I'm teaching students right now professional style and editing, and Steven Pinker argues there's a very strong divide between when we speak to others, that's very natural, he says, it comes glibly off the tongue, and then when we begin to write, it's a more tortured act and a more thoughtful act and a more conscientious act. So he suggests you can get it right when you're doing that. And I have to confess, when I was reading Postman, I kept thinking, but crazy thoughts have to be put into words. This is great, this is the process we all want to understand. How do you begin to conceptualize and make coherent the perceptions and then the jumble of cognition. But I guess that is the heart of media ecology. It doesn't stop at talk. You can take it to the next step, which would be the written form, and then you could make that crazy talk. Then you would see it. So now I'm going back to this chapter and being very chapter driven. But he at one point said, George Orwell said, as soon as someone talks crazy, they'll know they talk crazy. And he said, no, I'm going to take him up. He's way too smart for that. And he didn't even, point taken, he didn't even hear. He just said a crazy thing. But George Orwell's a writer. And if he wrote that, then he would have rewritten it and rearranged it. So I mean, that's media ecology too. I mean, we're talking about just personal expressive. But I'm wondering if you get to this other level of what it is that you would say, and you're able to refine, and maybe that is, the great liberation and joy of writing that moves us beyond into the air. Small and big talk. Talk is cheap, all the things we say about talk. And maybe it's true. Except I'm starting folly.
Okay. No, Kathy?
Thank you. I've written down, I know you said I wasn't supposed to, but I can't help myself. But it all fits together. And I have to confess that it was interesting because I had tried to get a copy of Crazy Talk before I came, and I went online at the U of A, and a couple of days later it hadn't appeared. I was completely surprised it had been lost. So I went to Amazon Prime, and they said, yes, I could get it, but it still hasn't arrived. And Lance thankfully sent a copy of the first chapter. Meanwhile, I'd been thinking about it, and I want to begin with a story that I encountered in a book by a French philosopher who recently passed away, Michel Serres. And it's an unusual book. It's a very little book called Thumbelina. And the Thumbelina is reference to what he sees as the new generation. Actually, there's Thumbelinas and Tom Thumbs, right? Right. And of course, they get that name through their dexterous interaction with their smartphones. In the middle of the book, he tells the story of a bishop who's now known as Saint Denis, who had been arrested and condemned to death. He was tortured along with a couple of his compatriots. And the Roman soldiers took him to the bottom of what is now known as, I think it's a special mountain. Actually, Camille might know what this is. A mountain in Montmartre in Paris. And their job was to behead the three of them. Well, they were lazy. And instead, they decided to lop off all three heads at the bottom of the mountain. A miracle happened, and Saint Denis picked up his head, walked to the top, and there are different versions of this, carrying his head, perhaps giving a sermon along the way, and that was that. It's interesting because I didn't realize that there is a name for this miracle, and I just need to put it. A photograph, or actually of a painting, a mural. This is by Léon Bonnat, and I'll distribute it. What's cool about it is, and this is where Serres takes this and notes what has happened here. So we have in the center Denis, who has lost his head. He's picking it up. And one of the confusions about how to portray these particular saints is where to put the halo. And this particular artist put it right above his neck. Okay, so I'm just gonna, if I can just pass that around so you can see. And here's what Surrey has to say about this. Not long ago, we all became like Saint Denis. Our intelligent head has been externalized outside our skeleton and neuronal head. In our hands, the computer box contains and manages what we used to call our faculties, a memory thousands of times more powerful than our own, an imagination stocked with millions of icons, a faculty of reason as well, since software programs can solve hundreds of problems that we could never solve ourselves. Our head has been projected before us in an objectified box. You can see where he has taken up this image. And for Surrey, this image portends an extraordinarily hopeful future. Tomorrow's Thumbelinas and Tom Thumbs, he says, growing up with their heads thus fully severed and in their hands, will be a new incarnation of humanity, liberated of the burden of memory, of storing information within the hard limits of their shut-in skulls. This radically exposed young human torso may now avail itself of a new intelligence and spirituality, open interiority. An intelligence that he says will be capable of truly inventive thought, possessing a cognitive ability to imagine a more democratic, more ethical, and more ecological future. So this is Surrey. Meanwhile, another contemporary French philosopher, Bernard Stiegler, offers a much bleaker diagnosis of our current situation. And while he doesn't reference Surrey, I believe Stiegler would surely agree on this point. We have indeed lost our heads. But instead of phoenixes rising to this unique spiritual and cognitively expansive occasion, for Stiegler, we cephalophores, it has a name, or head carriers, now find ourselves in a perpetual state of shock. And in this stunned and stuporous state, we are indeed stupid or crazy, or both. In his book, which is called States of Shock, Stupidity and Knowledge in the 21st Century, Stiegler quotes Adorno and Hochmeier, who wrote that stupidity is a scar. Every partial stupidity in a human being marks a spot where the awakening play of muscles has been inhibited instead of fosters. At the point where impulses have been blocked, a scar can easily be left behind, a slight callus where the surface is numb. Such scars can lead to deformations. So with the arrival of the digital, we have increasingly outsourced our memories as well as other physical, social, political, our friends, and most especially cognitive tasks, and have thereby created a scar and numbness, which I'm sure McLuhan would be quick to agree with, our thinking heads where that used to be for thinking. Our intelligence is deformed, and we are more and more, according to Stiegler, in a state of numb stupidity. On the one hand, the digital, artificial intelligence, and machine learning are profoundly extending our smart, cogitating selves. On the other, we are losing our expertise each time we give up our hard-won practices of thinking and doing to the machine. What is the result of our cephalophoric condition, our headless condition? The ability to reason, having been severed and outsourced, transforms into rationalization or stupid talk. Meanwhile, our semantic environments continue to be further digitized, that is, grammatized, then analyzed and reprogrammed by artificial intelligences and network infrastructures that are now infecting almost every aspect of our daily lives. And perhaps I'll leave it there. How's that?
Thank you.
Well, we're getting some negative vibes here. So we started out talking about in a sense, the digital environment. Can you go further into it? I think us here in the U.S. we've been kind of bummed out lately. So tell us about Canada.
All right, I will start.
Yeah.
As a newcomer, as a technically non-Canadian living in Canada. First of all, I never felt to be a stranger in Canada since I arrived. So that's a beautiful feeling. So you feel home, you feel welcomed, you feel this diversity of the environment, okay? And that makes a huge difference in the way people are exchanging, are sharing their own backgrounds, their own identities, their own heritage, and so on. So, and I think that this diversity really makes the semantic environment valuable and very inspiring. Again, I told you, as a newcomer, even with my broken English, my Italian accent, I never felt to be a stranger. So this, I think, is an important part of this sort of what I call the Canadian genius. The Canadian genius, if there is such a Canadian genius, is the diversity. And I believe that diversity is the mother of creativity. The more diverse we are, the more creative we can be. The more creative we can express our identities and so on. So I think this is important to acknowledge even linguistically, right? So the diversity in language, the diversity, there are, for instance, I'll give you an example that really speaks us to the way language works. One example, national anthem. The national anthem is untouchable, right? National anthem in any country, it's an institution, right? Italian, US, and so the national anthem is such a powerful institution. In Canada, they were so brave, firstly, to review the actual wording, the language of the national anthem, replacing some controversial terms and words, and this is important. But also, they translated the national anthem in the 12 most popular languages spoken in Canada. So now tell me, have you ever heard in any nation in the world a translation in another language of the national anthem? No. It's a unique, it's really the Canadian mind translating and having the national anthem. Of course, it was in French and English since ever. But now there is a version. If you Google, they did it for the Canadian 150th anniversary a couple of years ago. Basically, the Toronto orchestra, symphonic orchestra, they did 12 versions of the national anthem corresponding to the 12 languages of Canada, including Punjabi, Chinese, Italian. As an Italian, try to put yourself into my shoes. Sing it. Well, I can sing it, so, okay.
Stand up.
I want to stand up. But rather than, oh Canada, my own native land, you say something like, oh Canada, amata terra mia, which is Italian. So you can't feel, all right, thank you. But I don't know if you ever see that. Check it out. So it's called Canadian National Anthem, 12 most popular languages spoken in Canada, including the indigenous languages, which was a way to retrieve that legacy of indigenous people and indigenous languages as well. So I think that speaks a lot about the semantic environment in Canada. I'm not sure, I didn't check, but I think no countries in the world translated its national anthem in 12 languages as Canada did to celebrate diversity, to celebrate how language really shapes our semantic environment, really shapes our identity, really shapes the way we think. And I tell you this even as a non-English speaker, right? So you really feel reformatting yourself when you're going to grab another language and interact and share with another language. So this is Canada. Again, translating the national anthem in 12 languages and accommodating and reviewing the way people feel there's such an important institution as the national anthem in Canada. This is Canada.
You know, I mean, it's not the same thing, but I believe that the Communist Internationale was done that way, so that...
That's interesting.
Yeah, so it's like the same anthem, but, you know, whatever the country...
But this is an appropriation.
But that's different. It's not the same thing because it's nation to nation with this idea, but, you know, I mean, I guess from an American point of view, you're all communists anyway. Just kidding.
Right.
I just have a quick, I was with you all that way, and I actually have another place to go with that, but I can't help be haunted by Marshall McLuhan's predictions that nations will become unimportant, nationality, national politics will become unimportant, languages as we practice them, language as a binder will become less important. So in some ways, if some of that's true, it just calls into question whether Canada's being bold and brave or kind of allowing for diversity in an institution that no longer has that kind of power it once had to unite, or its kind of power to speak to nationhood. So I'm kind of inclining to the second one, but it's all where we track ourselves on from here to the future as well. So it is beautiful what you described. And I had a niece who sang the Cree version, and I was thinking, well, what the heck, why are they doing that? Like, so finally, you're even making sense to me, the beauty of being inclusive. This is what we have right now, and this is the way to make it available to people. I'm just saying, it just seems that it might be that language itself loses that purchase, and the notion of celebrating boundaries is already a kind of suspect thing. Identity politics, identity through land, through nations, those things being in the process of breaking down. So I don't know if we're sort of supporting old institutions by making them seem saleable in like a bouquet of flowers, right? You'll love this bouquet of flowers, but we shouldn't be taking those flowers anymore because they're representing a form of political organization and a globe that is kind of undergoing change. I just want to flip the question because you've talked about technology and how it changes us all too. And I shared this with my roommate for this trip, Carolyn Aronis, as young children. I wondered if she'd be as disturbed as I was of what I saw in terms of how we talk and what we see and how we study babies to get a sense of the first words and utterance and sort of that sense of how do you learn? Is it visual first or do we talk? We think of Marshall McLuhan's phrase too about Narcissus. It wasn't so much as looking in the glass, it was self-love. That was the first technology. Looking at water, we have the mirror. There's folks here who talk about black mirror as an extension of this. Anyway, what was going on beside me, in the seat beside me, was an unhappy baby and his mom. I have been there, so I have every empathy for her to do almost anything to entertain him. But she was entertaining him with videos of himself.
Oh.
First of all, just pictures of how he now looks. So he's looking at himself like, okay, what if I'm jealous? But then we get tired of those. She took videos of you at home playing. Oh my God. If we think we have a bit of narcissism right now, you just tied our circle pretty tight, because we know people whose favorite things are themselves. But if you're born and raised, I was desperately seeking other child mirroring theories that might. Maybe that's the next place to go. Is there some way to make sense of that so that it's not just truly terrible?
Sounds like Jacques Lacan's mirror stage needs some revision. Wow.
All right, I'll add something. I really appreciate your really positive vision, and I'm just thinking about our own habits in our family and the dismantling of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, which was this factor that had joined, like the railroads, so much of our culture.
Could you fill us in on that? Because I don't think we...
Yeah, well, so CBC is actually very similar to the public broadcasting system that you have in the U.S. And was shared. It was a known way. It actually started out as radio and then became television. There still is CBC radio, which I think is probably a bit more inclusive at this point in terms of culture. But what I was going to say, other than listening to CBC radio, is our family watches the American PBS. So our lives are filled with American politics. And yeah, well,
Sorry. Very sorry.
And why I bring this up is because it is symptomatic, I think, of this breakdown of borders and a recognition that what is happening here affects all of us, of course, and these are important understandings.
Kathy, could just jump in. What CBC pushes our Canadian culture, and we're so proud of it.
Yes.
Right? They're talking about the Weekend and Drake, and on we go with Canadian. I saw Christopher Plummer as one of the players, for example. That joy, and people who are funny, people who can sing, people who can entertain. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. But the drama, the political drama that will matter to us.
Yeah.
So what do you make of it then?
What do I make of it?
Yeah, what you're seeing.
In the U.S., well, I mean, I think that was one of the reasons why I wanted to bring this image of, if you look around and see us holding our heads in our hands. And there is a kind of stupor about it, a kind of not knowing about what to do, and how much of our political being, our social being, our intellectual being is perhaps being fed to us unwittingly through these mechanisms. And I'm party to that. I mean, there's no question about it. So I don't have a Canadian one. So this becomes this great colonizing force. We pretend we're in a post-colonial world, but in fact, we have the programming industry has colonized our attention.
May I say something?
Please.
Last year, just to give you an example, again, Canadian perspective on American politics. At the Book and Media Studies program at U of T, we hired an American journalist, a columnist, Sam Tenhouse, as an adjunct visiting professor to teach a course, Trump and the Media.
All right.
And before hiring him, I wanted to check whether, and I checked in the University of Toronto course offerings, and there were actually several courses with Trump in the syllabus somehow. That's why we took we took advantage of these things, and next year we're going to offer Trump, not Trump and the media, Trump and the elections. Okay, but it's going to be very nice. During the fall, it's going to be a fall term, so students will follow week by week the American elections from a media perspective. So that's why this is to give you an extent of the interest that still exists in Canada about the American elections, and the way politics became such an entertainment business from a media perspective to look at. So I wanted to share this. So Trump and I'll keep you posted. Trump and the media, and Trump and the elections this coming fall at University of Toronto.
Just jump in for a moment too. We certainly are riveted on what happens in the South, but there's all I mean, we're just sounding so innocent. It's because we replicated it in large part, and we're doing courses. Our new one is the Culture Wars, which has to do with, I mean, the Americans teach it. When do we become so siloed, so that certain groups work against each other? The left itself, you know, the feminists will not work with, Marxists will not work with. So there's this sense in which there's too much divisiveness, and so you see that, you know, Trump. It's really interesting to see what he's doing, but to some extent, the creep. Should we say more than Boris Johnson? The creep.
Everyone's experiencing
We
it.
We don't have a creep?
No, we had in Toronto we had a proto-Trump.
Yes, that's
The proto-Trump he passed away, so I don't want to. But
His brother.
before Dr. Ford, Bob Ford, his brother, was the proto-Trump. We had the copyright on Trump. That's Bob Ford. Back in the 2010, 2011 in Toronto. I was new in Toronto. I was there as a visiting professor for a little while. But this mayor of Toronto, Bob Ford, really kicked off the idea of Trump as a new kind of politician, engaged with different kind of business with cocaine and drugs and parties. So, proto-Trump. And now his brother, Doug Ford, and that's very, well, I can't really, he came to power a couple of years ago as for the province of Ontario. So now as in the province of Ontario, he got elected. He got elected with the same approach, the same style, the same behavior.
But Paulo,
Yeah.
I mean, it goes back to Italy, doesn't it?
We have a proto-Trump. We have a proto, which is still in power because basically the character you're mentioning that kicked off the so-called pop politics, right? The idea of pop politics. So.
What was his name again?
I have a sort of shame to press.
You won't say it.
What about Bolsonaro in Brazil?
Silvio Berlusconi, I said it.
Right.
Berlusconi came back to, actually he's a European, he's in the European Parliament. He's got elected in the European Parliament now. But again, so I think in the political environment, since the early 2000s, things changed, and the political communication changed, and I think this is a direct effect of the internet. how internet changed the way politicians do establish communication. There's a nice example here. Communication has Neil Postman makes two examples, two models. Ping pong communication, right? So, and the participatory model of participation, the communication as a participation, as a relationship, as a situation, which resonates. James Carey, the idea of communication as a ritual, and many other thinkers in the same thing. So, since then, since the advent of internet, back in the 90s, late 90s, political communication became a more participatory, more focused on different way of using language, using means to engage people, to get people engaged. And not by chance, in Italy, Berlusconi, Trump, in the media, they have been grown by the internet environment. So that's the culture, the culture liquid within which they were able to grasp energy and grasp attentions and grasp. So we did feed them. We did feed that thing.
But didn't I even start with Kennedy with television and the great debate?
I'm not sure. So
The one way versus the two way.
firstly, the debate was very well, sort of participatory, but didn't really move, didn't change the way people actually voted.
Did they ever say? I think it did.
But wasn't it so huge that, I mean, we don't want to simplify, but the one way versus the two way, like that stuff. Now if you have a debate, the shocking thing is it's the after debate forums on the internet, as if that's just as much, this is just as pressing as the debate itself. So what did you say? So it's so democratic and shared, and it may have lost.
I just want to speak
Well,
as far as technology goes. Today, Twitter and LinkedIn.
Well, one of the big changes today, though, is the internet, is social media. That's what you're coming up, and that has been linked to kind of polarization. And I think the point is that we're seeing this, from one place after another after another. It's happening in the U.S. It's happening in Canada. Happening in Italy, Brazil, in Israel. Actually,
Israel.
my rabbi just shared with me a talk from a well-known Israeli scholar, Goodman, and he said, well, I mean, he has this comment where he says, I always thought it was ideas that drove history, but Marshall McLuhan said it was media, and apparently he's right, because from social media, we've gotten these polarized divisions.
We have both. We also have the turn to postmodernism that preceded that technology was there to offer the tools and the opportunities. But a lot of postmodern theory argued that words were, if not meaningless, fluid, that they could mean various things. So that they really took away what might have been a false sureness, but that sense that words had meaning and weren't in flux. So you do that, and then you give people the machine to use the words however they want. So I wonder if the two things came together at a moment that really loosened.
Oh, I have a question here. What role do you feel the Vatican plays in all of this? I know this is a very, it's not so complicated. What role, in your view, does the Vatican play in this digital revolution? Your view.
Well, I think 5-6 years ago, Pope Francis started his Twitter account. Because Twitter doesn't allow multi-language. You have to have different accounts if you want to speak to different languages. So there is Pontifex official in Italian, and then English, and then French, and then I think a couple of dozens of languages of the Pope account. So that I think that's interesting. So the way that the church wanted to get into the contemporary media environment and use the same communication style, the same communication approach based on 140 characters, and then even more, but basically the shortness of the papal message, right? So, and I think this is interesting from a media perspective. So the idea that the church always, maybe not soon, not in time, but at some point, the church realized to take advantage of the modern communication means and channels to foster an identity, and not by chance. Think about Twitter. Twitter, we call them followers. We call them, there is such a same semantic realm embedded in Twitter, the idea of following, followers, and by the way, the very word communication means sharing something in common, communion, the community, all those words are related to the roots of Christianity, right? Are related to the roots of Christianity. And if we look back at the history of media, think about the advent of print media, the advent of the printed book. Not by chance, Gutenberg kicked off the print age by printing the Bible, and then eventually Reform, Counter-Reformation, and so on placed the church at the center of the communication environment. So I think today is happening the same. So the church is very aware of the fact that there is such a communication environment out there, and they have to interact and be there somehow.
I have a quick question to the person who put the question. There is, I'm not Catholic, and I've struggled with this passage. It seems to me McLuhan urged what you're describing as occurred. After Vatican II, there's a fairly lengthy couple chapters where he's dealing with what needs to happen, what should happen to make changes. Are you familiar with those passages too?
Are you
I
talking
think,
to me?
I think she's asking.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I thought it was in a book that you, it was a McLuhan Next, or, it was in a compendium volume, and I don't know.
He was extremely, as you know, private about his faith. And it was never part of any kind of public discourse. I mean, very, very rare. And he was hugely conservative, which people can't quite, put that together with the remarkable theories that he had. But, when you are a convert, which he was, to Roman Catholicism, that's all that actually really matters. He went to church every single day of his life.
But do you remember the passage in terms of what he wanted the Vatican?
I can't hear you at all.
He wasn't happy with the Vatican, or in these passages.
Well, the only thing that he wasn't happy about was when the Mass changed from Latin to English. That was the only thing that he expressed publicly, where he was such an advocate of the Mass being said in Latin. And that was a very personal thing for him. We're talking about something deeply, deeply personal. A person's faith is a person's faith.
But I think we can actually understand that in terms of, the semantic environment,
Right.
in that having something, having a significant part of a religious service in a language that is not ordinary
True.
helps to create a different kind of environment.
Radically different.
It works for, for my people with Hebrew.
Right.
But also, I personally regret that our prayer books lost all the kind of like Old English, so all the thou and amidst, all of the, thou.
Different now? God
Yeah.
is no longer he.
Yeah, they also went to non-sexist language, to as much as possible. And some of that is fine, but the loss of the unfamiliar language of thou, the verb formations, that put it into a different a different category, created a different environment.
Would that be like in Orthodox, because I don't think it's in
Well,
Orthodox.
Monorthodox, they don't read in English, so it
No,
doesn't matter.
so
So,
Hebrew.
I'm Reformed, so that's
Okay,
how.
that's it.
But I guess we're getting very interactive early here, so let's.
The audience is warming up. I see.
But Diane, you have your.
Yes, I think it's rather, this is just a general comment. I think it's rather ironic that all our communications media were supposed to bring us together. And it's done just the opposite. The better we get at communicating with each other, the more polarized we are. It's just, I think that's a major irony, because we always thought that if we could speak to each other, if we could understand each other, if we could get together, how marvelous it would be. And it isn't that way at all. Thank you.
Can I comment
Captain,
on that?
please.
One of the more important things, and actually just being able to recognize with Postman's crazy talk, stupid talk, is what has been called by Stiegler is the pharmacological nature of technology, meaning it always gives and it always takes away. I work with a lot of young people at the U of A, and their whole social lives, their intimacy is lived through social media. So they have these connections that weren't there before, and meanwhile, as much as that's moved, we've got this polarization that you're talking about. And I think what we're not prepared for is how blown apart things are and how intimate they are in other places. So in any event, I was just meaning to bring up this, we always keeping in mind this more media ecological understanding of each time these technologies are thrown into our culture, they have these profound and sometimes profound effects. So now what, right? Now what? We're working with such powerful media.
Yep, and certainly one of the important points is we never know what the ultimate effects are going to be. So and usually when people say what they're going to do right off the bat, they're entirely wrong. They said television was going to bring culture to the masses, right? Ballet, opera,
PBS does.
And it does.
and nobody watches it. Well, you're outliers.
I have,
Terry, go ahead.
I have a question and a comment, or kind of a question. When you mentioned this, the thee, the thou, and it missing something in Hebrew versus Latin, did you feel that it's more sacred to leave it in this form?
Yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I understood that.
Actually, when you look at the root meaning of sacred,
Yeah.
it's separate.
Exactly. Well,
That's
that
a
makes
separation.
sense to me. And I wondered when you brought up this idea of the confessional, so what are the tenets? The amount of silo and alienation that, I was waiting for you to say that there is a payment for this confession on social media, and I thought the lack of privacy is the penance, but also perhaps this tribalism and silo. Maybe we are in an intermediate stage. They're using this term liminal stage, and maybe ultimately we move forward from this tribalization and separation. And, to talk about the global village, that meant we're all together. But what we have now is the tribal separatism, and we have this cross-cultural tribalism happening where Bolsonaro in Brazil is worshiping Donald Trump. But we might be in the process. We need something, I guess, to bring us together. And I've been thinking about this for quite a while. And recently this Gates fellow that does, on PBS, does the genealogy, he said something fascinating last week. He said, I think we have to be within our groups in order to be socialized and become human, and only after we understand our place within a particular cultural identity or religion or whatever, can we then have the intelligence to recognize the humanity and the sameness in other groups, but that you have to be socialized first within a culture.
That's really interesting.
Isn't it?
Where I was seeing McLuhan come up when he predicts maybe things could be good, the question that's left off is, but what can be the commons to bring all these differences together?
Right.
And there's never an answer, because he didn't know, and we don't. But you're saying
But
maybe you
this is-
start with the building block.
This is what I think the only thing we have now to think with that might make connections ultimately, and thinking, that people will start to pay attention to and appreciate. I first have to be part of my family and my culture, and I learned this, and now I look for it elsewhere. Instead of, I'm going to get you, I'm going to go back to mine. It's the same thing with men and women. Men and women have more in common than differences. And it's that same kind of separatism.
But you're talking values too. The other question is the what to do, right? Maybe the small groups, this is what freaks me out. What's everybody going to do as technology takes over and takes over progressively? So you see those pictures of Ron here and in those cities that were meant to be mega cities. Then they kind of sketch out how you might live there. You might have values like I'll care, I'll support my family, I'll be loyal first. Those could translate. But then you're left with, what is our project? What are we all doing? So I think maybe one way around it is, McLuhan's vision is it's not done. It's
Right.
always unfolding,
That's
right? So
right.
we're going
It's
to keep
evolving.
figuring it out, and we're participating. So together, it's a
Evolving.
real collective democratic evolution.
I skimmed what Prince Charles said this week, and he had some very interesting ideas about this.
Well, you need
I
some.
I can't speak to it because I didn't read it as thoroughly as I should, but he is talking about community, economics, political, saving the environment, all of those things.
Well, this is Jacques Ellul, who's also very significant for us.
Right.
Like the slogan, think globally but act locally.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what you're
Yeah.
pointing to as perhaps a way out of it. I remember, you mentioned James Carey, and he used to tell the story, Lewis Mumford, who's, kind of like one of the foundational scholars in media ecology, but his great inspiration was Patrick Getty, a Scottish scientist. He was a kind of pioneer in urban studies and technology studies, and he goes to Dundee to learn, and Getty says to him, well, how well do you know your city, which of course is New York, Mumford was from Flushing. How well do you know your city? First you have to know your city before you can study other people's cities. So
The same thing.
that also seems to resonate with
It's right on.
what you're saying.
No, thank you for pointing it out. Also, there's a fact, the global population is moving to cities. So actually, currently 50%, 54% of the global population lives in cities. But this percentage is going to grow in a few years, according to estimations. 70-80% of the global population will live in cities. For instance, from a political perspective, that must be taken into account. Think about Brexit, think about Trump, think about even in Ontario for the dark election. So cities count less in terms of democratic representation. Instead, in cities live the majority of the people. So that's why this is a global scenario that really should make us think how to rethink democratic participation, rethink the electoral system in terms of this urbanization, new urbanization of society, which is going to have more power in cities. There's a movement of a coming back of the city-state idea, the idea that cities really, but think about a city like Toronto. Toronto is 3.5 million, Toronto area, GTA 6 million, 6 million, all right?
Huge. Saying as a New Yorker, that's cute.
All right, but 6 million out of 35 in Canada, it's almost 20%. So in one city. So that's why cities should count more in terms of how to rethink the way we foster cultural participation and democratic participation. Of course, not to speak of New York, or I think the largest city in the world, I think it's Calcutta, or
They keep changing.
Manila. Okay. However, there are
Seoul is one
some
of the
cities
biggest,
which are larger than entire nations in the world. So this is a fact. This is something that we should really take into account.
It's a great point, and that's a very specific kind of semantic environment when you think of a city, because everyone is so packed together and there's so much diversity in one spot.
Right.
Tokyo is the most popular city.
Regarding dense cities, you seem to notice a homogeneous theology, or not even in terms of religion, but just idea. Don't you think that would less thought diversity as these megalopolies start to grow in size and reputation, and people want to leave the rural farmland to migrate to the big city, in the same way the Japanification happened to Tokyo, and it lost its reputation in terms of economic power in the last 10, 15 years. Don't you think that there could be probably an unintended consequence of that?
Well, definitely yes. But when you have this megalopolis, there is one issue that really pops up, is the inclusion. How you can make these people feel welcome, right? How to include all those diversity, all those diverse people living together. And this is where, for instance, digital technologies can play an important role. Because digital services, so we do actually are conceiving our cities as an entanglement of digital services and practical means that we gather in cities, we do share spaces, public spaces, and so on. So this is where digital cities, the idea of digital inclusion really makes a difference. To Again, for instance, to give you an example, conceiving libraries as not only as public spaces, but as a space where people can gather and learn how to take part of the digital environment. The libraries as not just as a place where books are preserved, but a place where people are can have the means, right, to participate in the public sphere. So libraries. Museums are not just for putting, hanging some work of arts. Museums became a place where people share and socialize and so on. This is the role of public institutions in cities particularly, to really make cities more open, inclusive, more diverse. In digital technologies, I think there's a buzz on smart cities and so on, but the core and I think positive concept of smart cities is the idea of smart citizens, right? Which are welcomed, first of all, which are active, proactive, which are able to make sense of the digital semantic environment, able to make sense of how to deal with all those digital issues such as privacy, such as democratic participation, and so on. So that's why, again, cities play a very important role, and digital technologies, the digital environment, which is embedded into the city environment, the urban environment, really has a potential to foster civic participation.
But by the way, Tokyo has according to Google, Tokyo has the largest population, equivalent to the entire population of Canada.
35 million.
37.
I was just going to jump in and say a few more things about the dip. I mean, we've been talking about things that could work for the good or could work for the bad, and as soon as we bring up smart cities, we've got that spectrum of possibility and tragedy circulating as well. In a smart city, we get the sense of imposition, things being done to us, infrastructure that's created, and then we are willy-nilly its users. Whereas if we move, it's all in a term, but if we move to sentient city and developments there, where design efforts have been deliberately and slowly rolled out to get the involvement, to get the citizen participation, and also you have a buy-in so that if you don't like something, you can change it. It's a different way of having the city on roll. So I like a bit more reassured by sentient cities than the mega-rich smart city design that tends to generate lots of statistics for somebody. That's a scary thought too. The other thing I was thinking when you were talking about the fact that we do congregate in large cities now, and we do need to share commons and things that will, constitutions and certain regulations, so we haven't gotten rid of it the way McLuhan envisioned, at least not yet. Country, land, boundaries, politics, we still have those things. But maybe one of the things that maybe there's where online communications actually siphon off some of the tensions that might otherwise exist with proximity, because I might live in New York and I might see myself as neighboring and in this community physically, but my tribe can be identified so widely spread. So I'm not saying anything new with this, but I think it's a positive reading, so it's the one I kind of like. The fact that you're here, but you're elsewhere, but if here is made fulfilling, and that you can understand your role and commitment and what's accomplished by being in this physical space, yet you're also able to find the others out there. It also gives a much nicer view of what potentially, instead of it just being a cosmopolitan world that for some, like for the tech fast, it suggests there really will be a globe that will have all people, and our boundaries are broken that way. And maybe that was more what McLuhan was getting at too. It didn't really have to be we're breaking a boundary. We're breaking those boundaries by forging these network relationships. doesn't place put aside.
Thank you. It comes to my mind a beautiful opening that Louis Mumford put at the beginning of the City in History book. The opening says, roughly, this story starts from a city that was a world and came to the world, which is a city. So the idea that on a global perspective, think about how to regulate artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those technologies that are going to impact deeply our society. We need to think the world as a city, which is something that Louis Mumford captured, understanding the history of cities through our times. The idea that, again, we need to address those topics from a global perspective. Global regulatory markets on a global scale are necessary in order to make AI safe, secure, affordable, trustable. So all those values that we want to embed into our technology and emerging technologies must be addressed from a global perspective, right? We can't just let private companies or governments rule their own these huge employments. So it's time to, one of our fellows in the Media College Association from New York, Douglas Rushkoff, is advocating of the idea of team human, right? So the idea that it's a fundamental question. What makes us human, right? I think, among many other relevant answers, what makes us human is a symbolic semantic environment. So we do the symbolic, the system of symbols we are able to create in order to survive and make sense of this world, right? So we do need symbols. Douglas Rushkoff points out the idea that what makes us human is the ability to cooperate, to collaborate on a global, large scale, right? Beyond the boundaries, beyond the geographical areas and so on. Well, I think that makes sense on the idea of semantic environment on a global scale. So where our symbols, religious, cultural, political symbols, now make sense each other in relationship, right? And with the ability of make sense of other symbols and how we can, again, being able to get these differences in a meaningful way on a global scale to manage, to rule, to forecast the impact of these emerging technologies are going to have on our life.
If I can just pick up one more, because you're housing this in Mumford, I'd love to hear that. If we go back to McLuhan and his image of satellites and how it changed everything, I wrestled with that for the longest time and saw it as a very aesthetic kind of comment, meaning we'll have surveillance or it'll affect how we'll communicate differently. Now we'll have, it's a bigger image, so images are important, the semantic, the metaphors that we're generating. He basically was, it's addressing climate change. He's basically saying, you make the artificial environment, you made an engineered environment, there's no nature left, you did that. Okay, wait, watch, let's see what happens next. He wouldn't say, dear diary, I think a flood's coming, but, that was, it's all there. You say, you start putting things in the sky that weren't there before, you take pictures,
God promised no flood. That's the rainbow. It's fire this time.
We have both. Australia has both, so it's saying it'll cover the bases.
McLuhan had a phrase, the herb orbs, and it's also about other kinds of technology. So think about air travel, and it's like you're in one city, and you go to the airport in that city, you know, maybe it's like a little outside, but you're basically in the city, and you go into this sort of like room, and it sort of vibrates for a while you're in there, and you watch some TV and stuff, and then it stops, and you leave that room, and you're in a completely different city somewhere in another part of the world. So you're never passing through anything other than cities, and in that sense, it becomes a network of all cities. But I did want to say, and I don't want to like, it's such a beautiful image you throw out, Paulo. But you know, I mean, I drive into New York from New Jersey, and there's this building. It's still not quite finished. That is towering. I mean, there was another one that was finished a few years ago that's taller than the Empire State Building, and now there's one that's just towering over that one. I think, Tom, you know what that building, that, you know what I'm talking about, the one that's just
Yeah,
the
the
biggest
Metropolitan Tower. Yeah.
and it's all real estate, right? It's just like, it's no longer, I mean, the Empire State Building was offices, you know, the Chrysler Building was about industry and offices, the World Trade Center, this is real estate. This is just apartments for people who don't live in New York and are just coming here from somewhere else, you know, I mean, and it is this sort of like upper echelon, this global elite class of incredibly rich people who want to have an apartment in New York. I mean, that kind of fits in with the picture we're painting, but not in a pretty way. You know, in fact, in a pretty awful way in a lot of senses.
And in a lot of cases, they're not even coming. In a lot of cases, they're just parking their money.
Exactly, mostly parking there. You know,
Building right next door to the club.
is that Airbnb? That is owned, it started at 16 million a floor and went up to 42 million. There's not one person living in that building, not one. And no American bought in that building.
Low cleaning bills.
You play your stereo really loud.
Rooms, now they put curtains up.
But by the way, cities and vehicles, just wanted to hear what you think about technologies of transportation, by the way, as containers and as places where actually diversity and people can actually, in the local place, before we are thinking about the big idea of being connected to people that live outside of our very specific place. How people are actually getting connected together in the subway. I tried to save money for media ecology and I took the subway today. It was a very interesting experience of seeing so many different people interacting with one another. I agree, some people went to their phones and interacted with others, but people from different races and statuses and places were just interacting with one another because they were stuck with one another, touching one another, not in a pleasant so much situation, but there were conversations happening that we would not actually see in other I don't know, places. And also on the airplane, I had the experience of someone throwing up for the whole flight from Denver. And then a doctor from, so she was from New York, the doctor was from Denver, came and took care of her. So this kind of conversations and relationships and interactions in what we can see as vehicles, as containers of diversity. So I don't know, so if you can reflect the three of you of technologies and vehicles and places where diversity can actually happen in the local and cities.
I just have to, connect to that because that's Christine Nystrom wrote a piece about transitional spaces.
Oh, really?
And, whether it's like a railroad or bus station or on an airplane, it's places that people have no one has a stake in, so people can kind of do anything, which is why the bus station, for example, is a very dangerous place. You don't want to hang out in. But it also goes back to the idea that people in airplanes striking up a conversation. This is more so before we had little screens, where everyone had little screens to watch, but could just like totally make up their life story. You know, you could be a completely different person. That was a well-known phenomenon. Terry used to do that all the time, right?
All the time. Fabulous. And that's it.
The imposter.
Just a couple of words. I think we are still paying the consequences of conceiving transportation as an individual activity, very intimate. So the mechanical bride, the idea that my car is an intimate space where I do gather my thoughts, I commute, I go to work, I go wherever I go, and so we are still. And the idea you depicted is beautiful. So in a day where there won't be any more private cars, because we will give up the ownership of our car, and cars will be services, will be a service. So in that day, I think it's a beautiful image. But still today, I see that people conceive their commuting or as a very personal, intimate experience. However, I'll give you an example. I wanted to make an experiment with my students. It was a class on media, readers, readerships. So I took 180 students to take the subway in Toronto, 4 trains. They took 4 trains, 20 groups of students to get into the trains and read aloud. It was a sort of flash mob based on readings. It was we call it guerrilla reading. So I think I did the risk to get fired, but eventually everything was great. I really felt the idea that public transportation can be a place where people socialize. Nowadays, I don't see this. I see it's a beautiful place to see the diversity. You look at the people's face, and you really see all the world in one couch, in one train. It's beautiful, but I think people are still feeling the commuting as a personal, intimate experience. But when my students went there and reading aloud poems and other things, there is a video, if you check on YouTube, Guerrilla Reading Toronto, TTC, subway. We took the train for a couple of hours, back and forth on the subway line. I really felt that might be a beautiful picture of the future, where subway in this case is where people socialize, share the pleasure, the love of reading, share the pleasure of talking together, as we do in Italy, for instance, in the public squares, in the public piazza, right? In the piazza, people gather and they just talk with each other, right? So the idea of retrieving the art of talking and getting together and using the public spaces for that. Also because there will, again, so if all cars will be driverless cars, there will be no parking slots at all. We don't need any parking slots because essentially all cars will run all the day, no parking. Imagine a city. Imagine a city with no, but that's gonna happen for sure. Imagine a city with no parking slots, and sharing commuting, sharing cabs, taxi, Ubers, and so on with strangers, and maybe taking the habit of talking to strangers. Yeah, beautiful feature.
Strangers everywhere I go.
Me too.
That's right, that's why I met you.
In Canada, you always say hi to a stranger. If you cross someone else, you always say hi.
We do that here.
And say good morning.
I think Terry McLuhan, who lived in New York and Canada, can tell us something about the difference. But when you talk about car as a private experience, at one level, but there's the rules of the road and the traffic and the highways and the system. So that's one aspect. But there is a communal part of that as well. So I think we have to always look at the environment in total, because that's a private experience. What else is going on?
aren't we, like, right now too, that it might be on the extreme, it's hard to think ecological shaming as extreme, but private cars are done.
Oh, right,
because we
yeah.
can't tolerate them. Coming to this conference, you wouldn't think how many colleagues said to me, "You're going where?" You know, so at least we moved into that. We have to feel a little bit of embarrassment for what used to be, you know, a complete joy that you can pack up your bags and have a holiday or a work that was removed from where you were. But the whole seeing it as such a privilege and an advantage with the carbon footprint detriment, you can take all of that into consideration too. But I met a few nice people on the airplane.
Well, Kathy, how
Sure.
about you?
So my first comment would be that all technologies are containers or bridges of some sort. So our homes or but I think I again love your example, but I think those are anomalies. They're anomalies. I've got on my phone from all the various airports that I visit pictures of people on their phones, just lines. And the last one I was just showing my husband is an Air Canada agent, also enjoying something funny on his phone, right? Rather than, so there's something about this homogenization, I think, of our experience, where no matter what airport we're going to, we expect certain, they're all different. I really like Chicago Airport. I'm now more familiar with LaGuardia, and I will not go to Toronto Airport. I always end up having to stay overnight, so unless I'm staying in Toronto, I won't go there. But other than that, it is this, and so I guess I'll say one other thing, bringing us back to semantic environments, is I was thinking about what you said, Paulo, about Twitter and followers, and we have friends become in Facebook a kind of friend. In other words, our vocabularies are also being taken over and redefined for us in a similar way of this moving from one. We expect it. We expect things to be all exactly the same where we go. And while we might be delighted by the differences, only so much difference. So can I say one more thing? Is I was fascinated with that image of going from New York to Dundee and being told to go back to understand one's culture. But I think, and this is the danger, is I think it's only by going to another culture can we go back and see our own culture. And if it's all the same, then our reflective capacity will be so diminished, that diversity, that difference. And same with language as well. Thank you.
What if it were required of our president to be president, he had to speak 3 other languages other than English? He would know something about culture, because language determines thought. This is true, I believe. People argue against that, but I really think if you know another language, wouldn't that be something that should be required of our politicians, perhaps?
Another constitution too.
Canada, it is actually.
Literacy, I mean.
Or constitution?
No, here.
Well, you'd be lucky because he would be out, wouldn't he? He has no
guerrilla reading,
patience to undertake that kind of thing, so you would disqualify
You
him.
just say, I know
That's
big
right.
Latin.
People would be disqualified if they didn't know 3 languages.
Don't you think,
Now we're into utopian society.
isn't Trump, though, like, sort of a negative version of Paulo's guerrilla readings?
Yep.
Why? Because there is this sudden understanding of the Constitution, of what we've taken for granted. And now, things that we hadn't seen. What's yucky about it is, because can you imagine your students doing that day in, day out? The police would be there saying, no, you gotta stop the poetry reading, right? Wouldn't that happen?
And what about the other people in the car? Wouldn't they object?
Wouldn't they
read their own book, and they can't because these people are in there screaming in their face?
No. First, they were aware that we were going to do this kind of flash mob. Second, they told us be very kind, don't push, don't be...
The Canadians.
Exactly.
If they did it in New York, they'd get most.
Also, they were also filming and taking pictures and so on, always asking before if they were comfortable in taking pictures and so on. Canadian. And eventually, nobody complained, but they were surprised that students could share this love of reading. But to go back to the language thing, yes, in general, politicians in Canada, they do speak both French and English. Any formal communication of our Prime Minister is delivered both in English and French, shifting and swinging between French and English. It makes it very cool. And I'll give you an example. If you go at the AGO in Toronto, the Art Gallery of Ontario, is basically a contemporary art museum. As in now, only one gallery, but basically the labels on the walls are in English, French, and indigenous languages. Yeah, so they wanted to put this symbolic gesture of acknowledgement in naming the work of arts, naming the labels in the museum. English, French, no, by the way, first the indigenous language, and then English, and then French. Go on AGO and you will see that.
But just to be fair, many of our politicians now do speak Spanish.
Yeah.
And it's very much, it's certainly among the Democrats, it's very common, but we're also seeing it, when you think about Mario Rubio and Ted Cruz and and Jeb Bush too. We are seeing that happening. Obviously, with the current occupant of the White House, it couldn't have someone more opposite of that sort of thing. But in general, I think that has been the trend. Yeah, please.
Can I ask a question to Mr. Banana? Do you think that translation necessarily provides inclusivity? Like, just because those things are translated, do you think those people had a say in what was being translated or put in their culture in any way? Because you talked about the anthem, and then you talked about the paintings, but it seems as though you're still translating kind of like a more Anglo version of history, right, into these other languages.
Well, thank you for pointing this out. I think it's not just a matter of translation, but using the proper language. For instance, I'll give you another example. The former Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, is now the Museum of Canadian History. Right? So, again, it's not just translating, but, it's a sort of translation into a contemporary language that reflects a different sensitivity in how we do use our words. Words are important, right? Language is important. So that's why, to some extent, it's not just an effort in translating, but an effort in adapting the words we use, even the words we take for granted, and reviewing them in light of the current sensitivity, in light of the new sensitivity that, particularly in Canada, I think we are fostering in terms of the so-called reconciliation, which is another keyword of the contemporary Canada, the reconciliation. we do not use anymore the First Nation as a label. You won't find any First Nation label. Indigenous people is more inclusive rather than First Nations, right? So that's why I think it's not just a translation, but finding new words, because the words we use determine the way we think. This is all about Sapir-Whorf and general semantics as well, right? So this is the effort that Canada is doing. Change words to change the way we think.
I mean, I'd like to add to that. Oh, sorry, if someone knows me. I was born in Yugoslavia at the time. You know, we all know it doesn't exist. But in terms of inclusivity, the language was the Cyrillic form of Serbo-Croatian, and then you would have Croatian, and then a form of Bosnian Croatian, which is the exact same language. You know, I speak and I read it. I read, you know, the Cyrillic form. There was a redundancy in the sense that they would have this sort of inclusiveness as a means of containment and not as a means of appeasement. We all know how it ended. You know, it ended in the Civil War and very bloodshed, concentration camps, all sorts of things. Do you find that it's kind of a, I wouldn't say a mirror in terms of Canada, but it just comes up as like a form of white guilt from an outsider? You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think my Canadian friends are more.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's an ongoing issue. The point is, let's take an example of prisons. If you want to go in and work with prison literacy, there'll be those who are supportive because you're saying you're opening doors and beginning to change that environment, make it more healthy, extending what you know, what you have opportunities to that otherwise incarcerated population. Having brought Angela Davis to preside over this and expecting her to be amazed at the street literacy and the moves we had made, her point was, you can, but I wouldn't touch it. You're propping up a sick system. Everything you do there will make that thing last 10 more years, so you're helping it. Well, I think it's sort of a parallel to what might be said about the vision that if we all share what was our national anthem, sung by the founding colonial nation, so to speak, if we were saying, but everybody can sing it. It's a solution, but I don't think we're any of us saying it's a fine, I don't think it's the perfect solution.
It's just a
step.
Yeah, and it's a step that maybe will raise, like what's coming through right now, more contentions, and then we'll have to rethink some of that. Maybe as we begin to realize languages in this.
And by the way, Yugoslavia is a great media ecological example because same language, two different alphabets, and
it's interesting because you look at
guys kill each other.
Yeah. And I was born in Bosnia, the brutal part, and so you look at the differences in Serbian and Croatian, and there are dialectical differences, but you look at the difference between Croatian and Bosnian, and there is absolutely no difference. There's a difference in accent, the lingua franca is still the same thing, throughout the region, with respect to like Macedonian and Slovenian, but for the core group of conflict zones, it was primarily this one concept. I understand language has its uses, it's just, it's an inefficiency that we somehow noticed in hindsight.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm interested in your term white guilt.
Right.
Because I think I can see how that comes, like you can perceive that from the outside. I think the intent of Truth and Reconciliation in Canada is really about Canadian responsibility. And I think while many are white, there's no doubt about that, at least as a Canadian, that's not how I perceive our nation, I guess. And so the shift from, I don't think the guilt, but a response. How do we address this history that now we are more potently aware of and try to reckon with these members of our society that, which I think the United States has yet to do.
But interestingly, what Canada is doing is translating the same language and imposing the same language on other people. It's not addressing the new people that came or were there before with their own values, with their own relation to the country. And I just want to give you an example. In Israel, there is a national anthem, but the national anthem talks about Jewish people that belonged to the land. The Arab people in the country do not feel related to it. They wanted to change the language. But Israel doesn't want to change the language.
That is a controversy.
Yeah. So, but it's a very good example because there is kind of an, I think with what Paolo said, that everyone in Canada want to be in Canada in that the same way and relate to the country in the same way. There is kind of a positivity within this. So you as an Italian is there and you're excited to have in Italy, or in Italian, to the same national anthem. But what if the national anthem just needs to be rephrased a little bit? Needs to change the language in order to feel connection.
Well, there we say we did it.
What?
We have done it.
No, but basically for the Canadian sesquicentennial, so in 2016, there was a discussion in the Parliament, a process of review, and a language changed. Language changed. There were a few, I don't remember, there were a few
instead of our
sentences.
sons, at all our sons command, we changed it to in all our people's command.
The people's command. So there was a review in language, very important. Secondly, there is a way of saying in Canada, so you become Canadian, but you keep your heritage. You keep your background, which is profoundly different from, generally speaking, what happens here in the US. You have to put aside your origins and background and become American. I don't know, generally speaking. But in Canada, you keep your heritage, you keep your traditions, you keep your the roots, right? Sometimes the language as well. For instance, public schools foster different languages. Saturday morning, many schools do offer Italian courses for learning Italian, Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, and many other languages. So there is a public, to me, intentionality to not lose those this heritage and the different backgrounds. I think this is something, that Canada, generally speaking, is very aware of. So let people keep their heritage.
But in America, when people were immigrants here, they wanted to be Americans, but they kept their heritage. They opened up different things. Chinatown,
cultural centers.
There's a little career on 32nd Street. My husband and I go all over the city, all the boroughs, to specifically look like there's a Shanghai in Flushing, and there's a little Hong Kong in Brooklyn. And we seek out these neighborhoods.
It's different, though. It's different.
But they don't want to speak English.
That's not...
They don't want to communicate.
No, that's kind of a prejudiced view.
I know, I love these people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a generational thing. It's like always the immigrant generation tends not to assimilate, but they want their kids to. And by the third generation, they've completely lost all ambition, and they're just like all the other Americans. But I just want to point out something, because it's not that well known in the U.S. that in the words of South Park's famous song "Blame Canada," it isn't a real country anyway. But in truth, right, you don't have a constitution that's been ratified because Quebec refuses to. You're still technically under England, which is why there's a Governor General of Canada. Right, and now you have a royal family to rule you.
See what happens when you're nice? People come back. I think we have a constitution. I'm just trying to roughly.
My understanding is that it was never fully ratified, which is why you'd still have
No,
a
no, it
governor
was fully
general.
ratified.
In any
Pierre
province, there is a
Trudeau-
local,
Pierre
First
Trudeau
Trudeau.
brought it home in 1967, 68.
Well, then why is there a governor general
That is
appointed?
totally pro forma. It's like having a king or a queen. I mean, it's really.
It's weird.
it's called a lieutenant.
Well,
A
actually-
lieutenant
No, but it-
technically represents the Queen in Canada, both at the governor
It's
at the
just a
national
different
level.
relationship, but it's.
But my understanding is it didn't fully become independent.
Yes, we have. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, we have. And that happened in 67, 68. It was completely ratified. Go back and check your history.
All right.
Yeah,
But
And we
one
were
thing-
no longer
I'm sorry, I'm just
No longer
relating what
the-
other Canadians have
One
told me.
thing I wanted to
The
mention
dominion
to
of Canada
Paul is about indigenous
that.
groups and indigenous languages. The indigenous population of Canada, as well as this country, and I've written extensively about this, have been systematically deprived of their language from the get-go.
Yeah.
Why? So that power could be exerted over them, their lands taken from them, and so on and so forth. And to this day, those indigenous languages are still not taught in schools, here and there, maybe. But this is their only source of beingness, truly being, is language.
Absolutely.
And indigenous is where it has been such a sore point and such a tragedy, such a sadness. And they are the only royalty that we have. You want to know who the royalty of this country is and in Canada?
Maybe more?
Indigenous people. They are, go back and check it
But
out.
in this regard,
They are the original custodians of this country and also Canada. I'm a dual citizen. My mother was American, my father was Canadian. I feel equally honored to be part of Canada as well as U.S. But indigenous groups, they have and continue to inform us, to teach us, if only we will listen.
absolutely.
Phenomenal.
And respect for the environment.
Yeah, well,
And by the way, 2019 was designated the year, the international, by UNESCO, the International Year for Indigenous Languages. And this decade, 2020-2030, has been designated the decade of indigenous languages. So, on a global scale, UNESCO is fostering the idea that if we come back to the idea of a semantic environment and language as an environment. If we do understand the value of those indigenous languages, we can understand the value of their legacy and heritage in what we are, and the way we can reconcile to those indigenous people.
and just as species are vanishing from the face of the earth and going extinct, languages have been vanishing. But languages, many of these languages have been vanishing without being recorded. I mean, over the decades. I mean, they're just gone, and once they're gone, and Edmund Carpenter talks about that. I mean, especially in that wonderful documentary that he has. Oh, what a blow that Phantom gave me! What a tragedy it is that languages are disappearing pretty much every day.
And that's another effort for UNESCO globally. The so-called the languages are, to many extent, intangible heritage, because for many languages we don't have written sources, documents, or they are not recorded. So the value of preserving intangible heritage, and very important, absolutely.
Yeah, I see that we're past time now. It's after 9 o'clock. So we're going to have to call it quits. I'm sorry, but we do have hard stop, as they say in broadcasting. So I'd like to thank our panelists. Thank all of you. Our next program will be on Wednesday, February 19th. And It'll be a surprise, especially to me, because I'm still figuring it out, but well, it'll be something good. So hope to see you all there. Good night.